This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to thank Ken for inviting me and everyone else for showing up this evening, and I hope you all find it valuable, rewarding. Behind me we can see a still from The Big Flame, a television play that was directed by Ken Loach and written by Jim Allen, first broadcast on the 19th of February 1969 on BBC One as part of the Wednesday play Drama Strand. And my MA dissertation opened with a quote from one of the characters, an older Trotskyist militant who advocated the occupation of the docks and the industrial politics of worker control. So his name was Jack Regan, and he said, "When them early morning risers were spouting socialism, I was too busy down in the ship fighting for peanuts. Not anymore. Now I want to see the big flame, Danny. I want to see one big solid mass of us that will point the finger at those raiders and say, you failed in your management of society, so pack your bags, think yourself lucky and go." So the subject of this evening's seminar is Big Flame, a group of militants who were active in the 1970s and early 1980s, who were inspired to take their name from the title of this TV play. And they shared the commitment articulated by Jack Regan to mass politics, and more broadly, I think their story is linked to one of the central themes of The Big Flame, which is sort of the relationship between class struggle and technological change, or certainly those are sort of questions that drew me into writing my master's dissertation on this group. So that still leaves the question of why I find myself telling their story and maybe why it's a timely story. So for those of you who were here last week, you might know that the story of Big Flame is entangled with my own family history. My partner's father was a member of Big Flame for most of the duration of the group, and so that sort of raises my own awareness of the group's history, but also perhaps poses some challenges and has definitely influenced how I've framed my account of the story of the group. And I suppose another reason why I find myself telling the story is linked into my own political background. So I've been politically active since I was a teenager. I've never joined the Socialist Party. I hope that doesn't make me a gatecrasher here this evening.
I've no idea. We don't
particularly given that for the past 10 years I've been active in maybe a milieu within the anti-capitalist movement which is at a certain distance from Marxism, so where you can counter anything from indifference to contempt and at best maybe a positive but critical engagement with Marxist politics. There are a couple of exceptions to this. I think within that political milieu I've spent time in, there are a number of intermingled currents of Marxism, Italian Marxist politics from the 60s or 70s that sort of still resonate quite strongly in terms of sort of workerism and autonomous Marxism. So my family history sort of links to my awareness of an English sort of strand of Marxism that's entangled with that Italian history. And then that also leaves the question of perhaps why is this a story that's relevant today? And I think this slide behind me sort of suggests possible relevance. So from over the past few years, from La Sapienza in Rome to London's Senate House, students have been deploying shields depicting works of literature. While the titles on these book blocks reflect the diversity of sort of contemporary radical student thought, a certain pattern does emerge. Titles by Antonio Negri, Nanni Balestrini, the Luther Blisser Project, and as we can see behind us on Mallet Street a couple of months ago, Silvia Federici and George Kafensis suggests the sort of influence of autonomous Marxism and workerism on many of those resisting the politics of austerity today. And perhaps this indicates a contemporary relevance to revisiting this history and doing it through a sort of a more local lens. So in what follows, I've adopted a structure that's based on sort of three periods. 1970 to 75, a sort of big flame emerges. In 1975, a sort of loose national network develops into an organisation. And then there's another transition possibly that I want to suggest in the late, sort of around 79 AD, which is maybe a shift from politics of sort of workers' autonomy towards a sort of socialist feminism. And also I think the Winter of Discontent's a very big element of the story that I'm telling, so I've sort of used it as a hinge. And then there's three strands running through the story as well: their industrial organising, their involvement with the women's movement, and internationalism. So I'm going to need to be quick if I provide some sort of context to those three themes over that period of time. The first issue of Big Flame appeared on the 26th of February 1970, priced sixpence, with the strapline, Merseyside's rank and file paper. A piece on the front page set the tone by announcing that if you live on Merseyside and spend your life being pushed around, this is the paper for you. From the outset, themes were explored that we revisited throughout Big Flame's history. They provided a shop floor perspective on industrial disputes, specifically in the motor industry and in particularly the Ford Motor Company. And while the tone was critical of trade unions as organisations, the launch was welcomed by a convener at Halewood. When in St Helens, strike occurred at Pilkington's, a glass manufacturer and Britain's largest privately owned company, Big Flame supported attempts to set away, of workers there to set up a breakaway union. And in the pages of the paper you find workplace struggles being related to the wider social issues of the day, with coverage of housing, unemployment and education. For example, one article linked the occupation of the University of Liverpool in protest of the Chancellor's support of apartheid with Pilkington's investments in South Africa and their ties to the university. The paper brought together members of the Communist Party, International Socialists, the Communist Federation of Britain, as well as individuals with no party political affiliations. Readers were invited to contribute articles and attend planning meetings, and facilities were offered to print leaflets and posters to local campaigns. However, signs of weakness appeared in the coalition behind the paper quickly, and there was a report in the paper of a first readers' meeting at the Swan Hotel on the 15th of March, which acknowledged that people attending were roughly divided between those who believed Big Flame should go on as it is and those who felt it should go beyond reporting to political analysis and taking of principled stances. Years later, a Big Flame pamphlet would describe how, under pressure for clear politics, the alliance came apart at the seams despite still selling thousands of copies. And the seventh and final issue of Merseyside's rank and file paper appeared in July 1970, just 5 months after its launch. The following spring, some former members of the newspaper collective readopted the name Big Flame for an intervention at Ford's Halewood plant. An internal report subsequently provided a rationale for this. It identified car line workers as the vanguard of the working class at an international level. The car industry was also represented as a key sector for capital. Both the focus on the class struggle of auto workers and the practice of setting up base groups demonstrate the influence of operaismo, Italian workerism, and the events of the Autunno Caldo, the hot autumn of industrial unrest in Italy in 1969. This sort of Broadly speaking, this perspective is associated with a critical attitude to the role of trade unions and reformist parties mediating class struggle. There's an emphasis on working class autonomy, which is a term we'll return to later. And it includes a Marxist analysis that focuses on the relationship between class struggle and technological change. I think it's also important that we appreciate the context in Britain in which these ideas resonated. So, in 1968, Ford's sewing machinist strike had led to the Equal Pay Act of 1970. I appreciate that the demands may have been wider than that, or framed differently from that, but it indicates the political significance of sort of struggles going on at Ford's. 1969, the Ford strike was a key moment in the defeat of In Place of Strife, Labour's industrial white paper. Ford led the UK sector in terms of investment, productivity and profit, while wage rates were lower than those of their competitors. So at the close of a 10-week pay parity strike, national parity strike in 1971, Big Flame produced a leaflet with Harewood workers that they distributed outside the gates, which may give some sense of the approach that they were adopting at this stage. A 2-year contract negotiated by union leaders was criticised for imposing secret ballots for industrial action, imposing penalty clauses for unofficial action, and failing to meet the demand for pay parity. But instead of holding union executives, Jones and Scanlon in particular, personally to account, it was argued that it's not the individuals, it's the whole setup, that is trade union mediation, that goes wrong. However, despite this intervention, or the wider context of it, all of Ford UK's plants soon returned to work under the terms of the contract. Subsequently, Big Flame went on to set up 2 further base groups in this period at Dagenham and Langley, 2 other Ford plants. This contract then came up for renegotiation 2 years later in 73, coinciding with phase 2 of the Tories' incomes policy. And again, Big Flame was critical, sort of held the unions responsible for diffusing shop floor militancy at this point. But in Dagenham, mediation sort of seemed to come under strain following the contract negotiation, with reports of riots, thefts and acts of sabotage taking place there. In September 74, in the run-up to the general election, Big Flame also reported on a strike in the press shop, Ford's breaking their contract just 7 months after it had been agreed. And at the 1975 Big Flame Motor Conference, they reported that we have better contacts and organisation around the country between the plants than anyone, including the union, with the exception of Ford Motor Company. I appreciate there might be a certain amount of hyperbole going on there in what it was an internal document. Something else I found interesting at this stage, that the Motor Commission, so the group within Big Flame who are organising in the car industry, were also keenly aware of the importance of struggles in what were perceived to be unproductive sectors of the economy, and also outside the workplace and the community, which I think is interesting in terms of how this sort of workers' politics in Britain is reflected back on. It's often perceived that maybe there's a lack of that sort of awareness of the importance of struggles away from the point of production. So in this period when Big Flame started intervening in the car industry, sort of quite soon afterwards they also become heavily involved in the women's movement. Against the backdrop of rising inflation and the emergence of the women's movement, Liverpool Big Flame extended their activity from workplace organising into the community. Against the context of the Housing Finance Act of 1972, which withdrew subsidy to house council housing. The Tower Hill estate in Kirby on Merseyside became a focus for resistance when the local action group called a full rent and rate strike rather than the partial rent strike that was perhaps more common around the country. Just as the strike was sort of beginning, women from the estate invited Big Flame members to help them set up a women's group. And what became the Tower Hill base group produced a report that appeared in the first issue of the Big Flame Journal, which sort of gives some insight into the perspective they developed. So this article, which then became a pamphlet, acknowledged the extent to which the action group had been effectively organised and the role that International Socialists had played in this. And it also reflected on their own limited impact upon the campaign. However, they voiced criticisms of how it had been coordinated, specifically the decision that the action group had made to liaise with the Shop Stewards Committee rather than leafleting workers at the gate was sort of identified as a mistake, which had resulted in a failure to mobilise workers at certain key moments. And it was also argued that there had been sort of a failure to take issues related to everyday life on the estates seriously, that there had been a missed opportunity. So, for example, mothers who were available to defend the estate pretty much 24 hours a day were marginalised from the decision-making process because childcare was sort of seen as an individual responsibility. And the women who were sort of making these criticisms, the women from Big Flame making these criticisms, sort of provided a theoretical context for the perspective they had, writing that we've been influenced by the writings of Maria Rosa della Costa in Women and the Subversion of Community, as well as our own social practice in the claimants' union movement. But also, at this, I don't want to overstate that, at this time there were also women in Big Flame who expressed ambivalence about the sort of perspective associated with Della Costa's analysis, particularly for its overwhelming emphasis on unpaid housework. So I think looking at sort of the third strand that I'm trying to tie into my account is maybe useful in helping to make sense of their industrial politics and their community politics at this point. Specifically the relationship to the Italian extra-parliamentary left. In the preface to an anthology of Italian articles, Big Flame, published in 1971, the authors asserted that the struggle must be social. We must find ways of struggle that go beyond the four walls of the factory. And this sort of echoes the social factory thesis, which is sort of developed by Mario Tronti, a leading figure from Italian workerism. And it also relates, so Maria Rosa della Costa and Selma James's analysis of social reproduction can be seen as a kind of a critical development of Tronti's work. But there are also other aspects to the sort of international politics that Big Flame are engaging with. Portuguese Revolution of 74, 75, in which Big Flame members participated, and the 73 coup in Chile were both sort of subjects of their analysis in pamphlets. Arguably the most important aspect of Big Flame's internationalism related to Ireland and the conflict there, which they viewed through the lens of anti-imperialism. Following the relaunch of the paper, the second issue included an analysis of Operation Motorman, the British Army assault on the no-go areas of the Catholic districts of Belfast and Derry. Rather than characterising these neighbourhoods as primarily being paramilitary strongholds, attention was drawn to forms of mass struggle taking place there, including rent and utility strikes and riots following the introduction of internment in August 1971. Readers were warned that the suppression of the Catholic working class in Ireland will mean a setback for the working class here. And the no-go areas were a source of inspiration for their members and supporters who were involved with the rent strike in Tower Hill. So the conflict in the north of Ireland was represented both as a sort of laboratory for state repression and also as an example of the revolutionary potential of social struggles that were based in the community rather than the factory. The Anti-Internment League had been a focus for solidarity with Irish republicanism in Britain during the early 1970s. However, as Diplock courts replaced internment from 1973, the League lost its raison d'etre, and Big Flame was then centrally involved in launching the Troops Out movement in September 1973, which sort of filled the gap that left in the political landscape in Britain. So in 1975, Big Flame, which was now a network of local groups, held a national conference. I believe Kevin pointed out that there had been a previous one, but at this one, delegates from Liverpool were joined by members from East London, West London, Manchester and Birmingham. And a number of documents circulated there entitled, "What is a Big Flame Group?" And I've had a look at two of these documents, and the thing which has struck me about them has been actually their common features. So they both share class analysis influenced by Italian workerism, both have a focus on how working class composition had been shaped by the reliance of Fortis production on semi-low skilled assembly line work, and the role of women and ethnic minorities in the bottom rung of the ladder of this process. In particular, the East London Big Flame version of this document provides a sort of three-part definition of workers' autonomy. So there's autonomy from class development, as in wage drift. So in ways it reflects the breaking down of the productivity deals from the late 60s onwards, under sort of Keynesian Fortis capitalism. Autonomy from capitalist institutions, including reformist political parties and trade unions. And the question of autonomy in terms of separate organisation and the power relations within the class. The East London paper argued that working class subjectivity needed to be built on the recognition of these divisions within the class, which couldn't be taken for granted. Despite the common features that I've sort of alluded to in these two documents, when the conference voted to form a national organisation in line with the Merseyside Big Flame document, East London Big Flame, who favoured a looser federal structure, sort of parted company. You see still here references to East London Big Flame as a sort of separate group, or I have. So we then move into a second period of their history as being a national organisation. At the beginning of this period, the Women's Commission reassessed their position on the demand of wages for housework, which is sort of associated with the politics of Selma James and the Power of Women Collective. As I've already alluded to, this perspective emerged from a debate within workerism, Italian workerism, and arguably sort of took the social factory thesis to its logical conclusion. Unlike many Marxists and socialist feminists who contend that such activity occurs outside of the sphere of production and is in some sense external to capitalist relations of production, Power of Women emphasised that social reproduction is productive of the very commodity that produces value under capitalism, labour power. Even those big flame members who are most receptive to this analysis recognise that POW will not want us using the demand of wages for housework because they considered Big Flame to be part of the male left. Others were more hostile, arguing that the association with Power of Women would do us a lot of harm at the moment because of their unpopularity and lack of credibility in the women's movement. At this stage, even detractors acknowledge, though, a theoretical debt to the Power of Women collective. But there are also issues that seem to be coming up at this stage that can't just be reduced to sort of the power of women collective, sort of sectarian isolation from both the rest of the left and the rest of the women's movement. I think Big Flame members, like many in the women movement around this period, become involved with politics of stuff like rape crisis centres and women's aid, which highlight issues around male power and sexual violence, sort of bring to the fore issues related to male power and sexual violence, which sort of called into question the adequacy of this sort of autonomous feminist analysis, if you like. Big Flame's internationalism also raised questions about how to develop a general perspective through struggles based in working class communities. An Irish Republican prisoner wrote to the paper from an English jail expressing solidarity to the comrades who produced Big Flame, who will be pleased to hear that it is read by all the political prisoners in the prison and also by a growing number of the general prison population. In response to Big Flame's draft manifesto that was that they'd issued at that time, he observed that while one could criticise the provisionals, the provisional IRA, from many viewpoints, they also demonstrated how such an organisation needed to be rooted deep in the working class ghettos and in people's struggles in order to succeed. Portugal and Chile both remained important focuses for Big Flame's international solidarity during this period, but following Pinochet's rise to power in Chile and the 1975 coup in Portugal, both these cases stopped being maybe sources for inspiration in quite the same way that they had been earlier. And Big Flame's attention shifted towards the national liberation struggles and civil wars breaking out in Africa, which also linked back to these earlier struggles as well in terms of the relationship between the Portuguese Revolution and anti-imperialist struggles in southern Africa. And this raised questions about how to conceptualize the societies that emerged from such conflicts. So, a 1976 conference motion was adopted that they claimed that the Soviet Union was neither socialist nor capitalist. However, China was presented as being on the road to socialism. The following year, Big Flame published a pamphlet drawing critically on the work of the American former Trotskyist Max Chapman, arguing that societies such as the Soviet Union were characterized as state collectivist, a form of class society ruled by a bureaucratic elite. I was going to say that this perspective was never adopted as a policy, but I think you might correct me on that, Kevin, so I won't. I think what I've taken from this is it indicates how ideas continue to resonate within Big Flame that now appear somewhat at odds with aspects of workerism and autonomous feminism. I find this sort of analysis relies on a more formalistic reading of Marx's law of value than that which is consistent with sort of the sort of autonomous feminist arguments and elements of the social factory thesis. And more importantly, or equally importantly, I think the text is framed in terms of a debate within Trotskyism, and it suggests that it was addressed towards other activists in the far left rather than a wider working class readership, possibly. During this period, industrial organising remained central to Big Flame's political practice, and this is something else that maybe I've got a question mark around, and maybe Kevin could offer some clarification. I think it may be the case that the Big Flame base group dissolves itself into the Ford Workers Group around this period. But nevertheless, I think what I find interesting is that Big Flame members play a key role in strike at Ford in 78, particularly in setting up the Ford Workers Group and the Ford Workers Combine. This was composed of shop floor workers, including militant stewards, and it was in preparation for another round of pay negotiations in October of 78. And two aspects of the approach they adopt, I think, may have actually had an influence on the outcome of that dispute. One was that they sought the active participation of spouses and partners of Ford workers, and one was that they rejected the pay restraint imposed by the Labour social contract, and the claim was made on the basis of need rather than by arguing an exceptional case. According to the Combine Secretary, Jack Brown, who someone's pointed out maybe I should have an inverted commas, as I know Jack quite well, Ford workers remained the lowest paid car workers in Britain and all of Ford's European workforce. Pressure was put on union branches nationally to support a demand for a £20 across the board pay increase, along with a reduction in hours to 35 hours per week. And 14,000 leaflets were printed and distributed nationally, and workers were included to wear badges, like the one represented that you can see up there, to work to show their support for the demand. Under pressure from the campaign, the Conveners Committee voted by 13 votes to 12 in support of the demand. Ford's initial offer of 5% was met by walkouts at Southampton, Langley and Halewood, which rapidly led to a national strike, during which the Combine produced the only bulletin distributed to workers, and officials failed to organise any mass meetings. Militants even recorded a song to raise funds for the strike. You can see some of the lyrics behind me. So it was sung to the tune of I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die Rag by Country.
Probably get most of them just to sing it, I think.
We can listen to the recording of it at the end if if we still have time.
We'll see how the time goes.
Yeah. And I think the way these lyrics are framed, these lyrics can be read through a kind of workerist lens, in that the economic demand for a pay increase is related to a political attack on Sonny Jim Callaghan, which may seem to be stretching a point somewhat, although as the lead singer is a translator of Negri's work, might actually be quite plausible. The Combine were not alone in developing a communication strategy during the dispute. In an attempt to undermine the strike, a Back to Work campaign was orchestrated by elements in the media, but this backfired when almost everyone who attended a demonstration in Southampton actually supported the strike. And I think this can be related back to the way in which the Ford Workers Combine welcomed the spouses and partners of Ford workers to attend the meeting, and sort of tried to see it as a struggle that was linked to issues around social reproduction. Or I think there's possibly a way of linking those. Ford met the claim in December, undermining the government's income policy and encouraging the further development of the wave of strikes now known as the Winter of Discontent. Despite the unforeseen political consequences of the Winter of Discontent, with the election of Margaret Thatcher in '79, the impact of this industrial strategy was much greater than that of the sort of political strategy that Big Flame adopted in this period through participation in the Socialist Unity electoral coalition with the IMG. I found that I felt inclined to sort of try to trace, and I think it came through some of the text written by members reflecting back on it, was tracing this back further to 1976, where Big Flame had a conference where they debated over two alternative strategies going forward. One was Plan X, to create a new communist and revolutionary organisation based on the politics of class autonomy. The other was Plan Y, to develop a more coherent politics, greater centralisation and a stronger national leadership. And at that conference in 1976, Plan X was adopted and Big Flame had embarked upon a project, on a process that they referred to as the project. And a paradox of this, to my mind, was that, and to a former member reflecting back who said that members' activity shifted away from local mass intervention and towards the distinctly organisational activities associated with the project, which drew the group closer to the IMG, an organisation which, despite their claims to Trotskyist orthodoxy, had their base most strongly within the women's movement and student movement. So almost by trying to embrace a sort of more autonomous politics, Big Flame gets drawn into a process that draws them closer to the IMG. In the fifth and sort of final period that I've focused in on, from 79 to 84 then, despite the power of industrial militancy displayed during the winter of discontent, the political defeat represented by Thatcher's election posed an immediate challenge to those attempting to develop a generalised politics based on working class subjectivity. Big Flame members participated in one such attempt. Lynn Segal, a recent recruit with a background in the women's movement and community politics in Islington, contributed to a pamphlet, Beyond the Fragments. Given the three authors' different political histories, including a background in the IMG and International Socialist, it's perhaps to be expected that Big Flame received fairly marginal attention in Beyond the Fragments. But I did find it more surprising that Lynn Segal's piece seems sort of particularly distant to me from the political trajectory that I've sort of tried to map out. She reduces the contribution of the Italian workers' movement to the lesson that the working class was prepared to fight for a better living. She asserted that Marxists have always argued that women's liberation would be achieved through her full participation in waged labour, something that definitely overlooks the perspective that Big Flame had adopted from workerism, from Italian workerism. And likewise, she dismissed Dalla Costa's theoretical contribution as perhaps not important, placing greater emphasis on her demand of wages for housework than on her conceptualization of the underlying role of women's unpaid work in the social reproduction of labour power. On the 30th of August 1980, 1,500 delegates attended a Beyond the Fragments conference in Leeds. Despite the high turnout and the breadth of groups represented, the event appears to have been overshadowed by a mood of pessimism. An intervention was made by women from the socialist feminist magazine Red Rag, which questioned how appropriate it was to work in mixed groups without first focusing on the theme of patriarchy and the need for men to change. While Lynn Segal took this point seriously, she also stressed the double standards of those Communist Party members who raised it. On the other hand, she dismissed complaints about the underrepresentation of black and working class people not already identified with the left as unrealistic moans about what had been a gathering of the white left to discuss its problems. Momentum appears to have dissipated relatively quickly from Beyond the Fragments and have failed to bring about a regroupment of the left, despite several local groups being set up during a brief activity following the conference. Big Flame socialist feminist politics seem to have moved further into the fore during this period. In 1980, the balance between the commitment to women's autonomy and the challenge of developing a general working class politics was explored in a pamphlet entitled Walking a Tightrope. This provided an overview of their activity in the women's movement, including articles about community-controlled health care, abortion rights, male violence against women, and the sexual division of labour, both during the unpaid shift at home and while in employment. While Dalla Costa's analysis was discussed, it was emphasised that it's not just capital, the ruling class, which benefits from the oppression of women. All men benefit from it. Male domination is maintained by a whole range of sanctions, and in the end, men use violence against women. Women from Big Flame also participated in the women's peace movement of the early 80s. A women-only peace camp outside a US airbase from which cruise missiles were being deployed received support from members who argued that one of the strengths of Greenham Common is that it is a women's protest. Hostility towards the camp from others on the left was seen as to reflect a state of paralysis which needed to be addressed, but not by attacking women-only events. Feminist theory explicating the relationship between militarism, male violence, and patriarchy was also defended. However, any essentialist notion of gender difference was rejected. I've misplaced the quote, but there was something about militarism and not being militarism could not be reduced to an inevitable product of having a penis. Nor was non-violence presented as being either inherently female or universally applicable political practice. The decision to take non-violent action should be based on tactical considerations rather than general moral principles. Big Flame's efforts to integrate feminist politics into their international perspective was also demonstrated in an article about the violent arrest of 11 Irish women for protesting outside Armagh Jail on International Women's Day in 1979. One of those arrested reported in Big Flame that we were suddenly attacked by 4 jeep loads of the RUC, armed with submachine guns, wearing their flak jackets. They began to beating us and dragging us to the jeeps. Some of the women were carrying babies, and these seemed to be singled out by the police for the roughest treatment. Big Flame followed the progress of the Armagh 11's trial. Members helped to organise international protests outside the jail the following year, which were attended by 350 women from England. Also, an industrial dimension to Big Flame's anti-imperialism came to the fore during this period in relation to South Africa. Interviews were reprinted from Fraud News, the paper of the Ford Workers' Combine, with trade union activist Thozamile Botha, which provided accounts of a major strike at Ford in Port Elizabeth. This emphasised that Ford workers in Britain and South Africa must work together. He insisted that during the strike in South Africa, British workers need to take responsibility for ensuring that parts were not sent there. Another article reflected upon the need to build opposition to apartheid among shop floor workers in Britain, with a call for workers at a chocolate factory in New York to support fellow Rowntree workers in South Africa. Rather than relying on an abstract moral appeal to the guilt feelings of chocolate eaters, it was argued that the anti-apartheid movement needed to foster such solidarity in order to organise a successful boycott. If opposition to apartheid provided an opportunity for Big Flame to integrate industrial politics into their internationalism, the Ford of Europe Workers' Combine was the clearest example of Big Flame's internationalism being put into practice through their industrial activity. The Combine was established in 1979 by a European network of revolutionary socialists, of which Big Flame was a founder member. Initially, it served as a means for militants to exchange information, make contact with each other, and to form a solidarity network. However, the scope of the Combine seemed to expand, and within 2 years they had held their 4th conference in Bordeaux. Shop floor workers were joined by union delegations from all of the European countries in which Ford operated, apart from Britain and Germany. Faced with the company's plans to radically transform the production process through what was referred to as Japanization, the introduction of new technology, including shop floor computers and robots, the Combine called for a united action throughout Europe in the defence of jobs and a 35-hour week. Initially, the Combine showed some potential to coordinate transnational opposition to the introduction of such measures at Ford during the first half of 1981. There was a strike at Halewood which forced management to withdraw a discipline code. At almost the same time, workers in Amsterdam occupied a factory in response to plans for its closure, and Portuguese workers went on strike demanding both increased pay and reduced hours. This led to a claim that with Ford Europeans management reeling under blows from Amsterdam and Halewood, they now face trouble in Portugal. There was even speculation that Ford workers' industrial action could have wider political implications, posing a challenge to Thatcher's monetarist policies. Industrial action seemed increasingly likely at Ford UK that winter as workers voted solidly to reject a 7.4% pay offer. One steward observed that clearly both the government and Ford were worried about the prospect of a strike at Ford. Ford was not in a strong position to withstand a long strike. Ford USA still needed the profits made by Ford UK to avoid bankruptcy. However, during the Christmas holidays, union execs withdrew official support for industrial action, and shop floor militancy was subsequently isolated, despite a mini riot that wrecked the union offices at Dagenham, a walkout at Halewood, and votes for unofficial strike action both there and at Swansea. While more work is required to piece together the rest of the Ford Workers' Combine story, it seemed to me at the time clear that the potential for Ford workers to pose a political challenge to Thatcherism was not fully realised. In Britain, industrial action by steel workers, miners and printers certainly featured more prominently during the 80s, and I think I might need to reframe that slightly after, in response to both some of the discussion that came up last week and to Sheila's book. Big Flame experienced steady decline throughout this period. Resignations at the 81 at a conference in 90. Resignations occurred in 1981 at a 1981 conference following the defeat of a motion proposing entryism into the Labour Party, although I think Kevin might suggest it was slightly more nuanced than that. A strategy that was adopted at this period by the IMG, amongst others. Those who remained were roughly divided but over two further proposals. One advocating a working class orientation and mass practice was rejected in favour of another which stressed sexual and racial divisions and the need to develop a practice and theory that understood and strove to overcome sex, class and race oppression. Following the conference, consensus seemed to remain elusive on the relationship between workers' autonomy and feminism. One member argued that women's unpaid housework was part of the story, but more fundamental is the way men oppress women, and we need a separate theory of patriarchy. Analysis highlighting the sexual division of labour was seen as inadequate to address questions of ideology and consciousness. The relevance of theory developed to explicate mass struggle under Keynesianism was also called into question in the context of the emergence of monetarism. In a reply recognising this as a serious critique of workers' autonomy, another member suggested possible routes to the disagreement. He argued that those who had left Big Flame to join the Labour Party had consistently rejected workers' autonomy and attempted to drag Big Flame back into the sphere of politics of left regroupment. Accordingly, from the mid-70s onwards, Big Flame turned to the IMG, to Socialist Unity, and fused with the revolutionary Marxist current and later the Libertarian Communist Group, and all the time recruited people without a proper deep debate and educational process. In this context, new members had misconceived workers' autonomy as a form of economic reductivism rather than a political perspective that offers a framework for interpreting the relationship between class composition and differences such as gender. In doing so, the compatibility of such an analysis with insights from feminist theory had been overlooked. Another member dismissed the very notion of working class autonomy as an ultra-leftist myth, which had marginalised Big Flame from the rank-and-file militancy of the early 70s, arguing that it took dissidents from Manchester Big Flame a long, hard struggle to get a saner, more balanced position on stewards, and the unions adopted by the organisation as a whole. The writer also claimed that the notion of class is itself in a process of erosion. So you've got a sort of what seem like slightly contradictory perspectives coming out there. On the one hand, sort of defending a more sort of traditional understanding of class, and then calling class into question as a useful category. Following a final conference in May 1984, only 17 members remained in Big Flame, while they continued to use the name for a couple of years, leaving the precise date at which they disbanded unclear. As a national organisation, Big Flame had been effectively extinguished. So that concludes the history of Big Flame. You're probably relieved, given how long this has taken, that my general conclusions are still a work in progress.
Okay.